Sing together. Some good worship there. Join us as we welcome each other this evening.
Tonight we continue our character study of the lives of 10 extraordinary women in the Bible, and through the series we'll look at their bio, their life and death, and the lessons learned from these extraordinary women. So tonight's is Esther, and I was told specifically not to mess this one up because I remember one of the first things I remember seeing in Hannah's apartment when we were dating was a book about Esther. And so I've been quizzed and told about this one and told not to mess this one up. I'm hoping that she's not at home watching yet. So, but yes, this is one of my favorite ones too. It's got a couple of different things in it that I remember just being the history major in me. And so this one was really fun to learn about this past 2 weeks since he's told me I was doing this one. So Esther's biography. Esther, which means star. That's not the right one. I have Esther. I don't have Hannah. I mean, I'm married to Hannah, but that's not the one that I learned this past 2 weeks, so you're going to hear a lot of other things. I looked up there, and that's like your teacher's worst nightmare is you start talking about something, and you turn, and that's not what's on the board behind you. Okay, so Esther. Hadassah is the Hebrew name meaning myrtle. She was born around in the 400s BC, birthplace in Persia, died in the 400s BC, and the death was in Persia, buried in Hamadan, Iran, 180 miles south of Susa. She was a queen, and she's first mentioned in Esther 2:7. So, Esther's life and death, we don't know much from the page. We know nothing from the pages of Scripture about Esther's life outside of the events of the book of Esther. Most Bible scholars equate the events of Esther's life with the time period that King Xerxes I of Persia was ruling. And so this would have been around 486 BC to 465 BC. It's believed that the events of Xerxes searching for a new queen would have occurred after his return home from a failed attempt to conquer Greece in 480 BC. These are the same battles that the movie 300 is about, and the 300 Spartans in Thermopylae and its defeat at Salamis. So that was kind of interesting for me because that movie 300 came out when I was around 17, 18 years old. And so that I remember going to it with my football team to go watch that movie on a Thursday night and turn around. We got beat 73-0 the next day by a team that we should have beat. So I will never take a football team that I am in control of to a movie before a game that you're supposed to win because of that. But Xerxes outside of this was a really interesting king. He very much had the ego of a king for him. And there are many who believe that Esther is a book of fiction because there is little extra biblical support for the events that are mentioned. However, there is an undated cuneiform text that mentions a certain Mordecai, or Mardukah, who was a high official at the Persian court of Shushan during the reign of Xerxes, and even before that under Darius I. And that comes from the New International Bible Dictionary. So there is historical proof of Mordecai serving King Xerxes during the time period recorded in the book of Esther. What we do know of Esther and Mordecai comes from the 10 chapters of the book of Esther. In Esther 1:1 through 2:4, we find that Xerxes held a 6-month spectacle for his nobles and military leaders to see the wealth and power of the Persian Empire. Again, I told you, he had the king's ego when it came to stuff. He wanted to parade his gold, his silver, his chariots, his horses, his armies all around. And so during the last 7 days, he held a banquet for all of those people to pretty much say, hey, this is how powerful we are. And it's kind of saving a little bit of face after his defeat in Greece and trying to make sure that nobody else around him says, well, he's not very powerful of a king if he couldn't conquer lowly Greece. So he starts to show off the wealth and might of his military. At the banquet, Xerxes sends for his queen, Vashti, to join him so others could see how beautiful she was, but she refused to come. The king disposed her as queen and sent out to find a new queen from among the women in the capital city of Susa. So after the search begins, we read about Mordecai and his cousin Esther. We find that Mordecai was raising his uncle Abihail's daughter after her mother and father died. Esther was one of the young women rounded up for the chance becoming the new queen, but before the young women were presented to the king, they were required to complete a year of beauty treatments. So when the time came for Esther to be presented to Xerxes, she impressed him so much that he chose her to be the new queen. After Esther became queen, Mordecai told her of an assassination plot that he had discovered. The men were arrested and impaled, and Esther gave Mordecai the credit for discovering the plot. The event was recorded in the history of the Persian kingdom. In chapter 3, we learn about a man named Haman, who was promoted by King Xerxes to the highest rank above all other nobles. The king instructs others to bow down before Haman, but Mordecai will not bow down to him. This enrages Haman, and he sets out to find a way to destroy not only Haman, but all the Jews. He convinces Xerxes to release an edict that calls for the extermination of the Jews on a certain day, the 13th day of Adar, the 12th month. The edict was sealed with the king's seal and sent to all provinces in Persia starting on the 13th day of Nisan, the first month. There were 11 months until Haman would eradicate the Jews in the Persian Empire. After Mordecai discovers the plan, he starts to mourn, as the Jews do, by wearing sackcloth and ashes. He makes such a spectacle that word gets back to Esther, and she sends a servant to figure out what has happened. Mordecai sent Esther a copy of the edict and told her to go to the king and beg for mercy for the Jews. She sent her servant with this message to Mordecai. All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned to the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to the king. Mordecai responds to her with wisdom in telling her, I do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. And so Esther, after listening to the words of the man who had raised her, agreed to help. She sent a message back to Mordecai saying, go gather together all of the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, day or night. And I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So after the 3 days of fasting were over, we see this game of political cat and mouse being played with Esther, Xerxes, Haman, and Mordecai. The only catch is that Haman thinks he's the cat, toying with Mordecai, but really Esther is the one that's calling all the shots in this. Esther goes before the king and is received by him. He agrees to give her whatever she wants, and all she asks is for Xerxes and Haman to come to a banquet she's prepared for them. When they're at the banquet, the king asks Esther for her request, and she asks the two of them to come to another banquet the next day. After the first banquet, Haman is disrespected by Mordecai again, and he gathers his wife and friends to discuss it. He prepares a 75-foot-tall pike for Mordecai to be impaled on as retribution for the disrespect. The night between the two banquets, the king can't sleep and asks for the chronicles of his reign to be read to him. He is reminded of Mordecai's discovery of the assassination attempt and finds out that nothing was ever done to reward him for it. Just as the king learned this, Haman entered the king's court to discuss impaling Mordecai. So the king asked Haman a question that Haman thought referred to him. The king asked, what should be done for the man that the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought to himself, who is there that the king would rather honor than me? Haman gave an elaborate answer of clothing the person with a royal robe, putting them on the king's horse, and parading them around the capital. The king immediately tasked Haman with doing this for Mordecai. Once he honored Mordecai, Haman went home to sulk and pout, but didn't have time to do so because servants came to take him to Esther's next banquet. At the banquet, Esther asked the king to spare the lives of Esther and the Jewish people. The king was furious and asked who had tried to do this, and she tells him that it was Haman. The king gets up from the table and steps out to the palace garden, presumably to decide what to do with Haman, while Haman pleads his case and begs for his life to Esther. Haman makes the mistake of falling onto Esther's couch as the king returns. A servant notifies the king of the pike Haman had erected for Mordecai, and the king commands for Haman to be executed on the pike instead. Following Haman's execution that day, Esther reveals to Xerxes her relationship to Mordecai. Mordecai is given the position Haman held, and Esther gives Mordecai control of Haman's estates. Esther again pleads with the king to overrule the edict Haman sent out, but it can't be revoked as a matter of Persian royal law. On the 23rd day of Sivan, the third month, a new edict is sent out to the provinces. The new edict allowed the Jews in every province the right to defend themselves and destroy their attackers on the date Haman set for their destruction, the 13th of Adar. As the Jews celebrated the news, and some Gentiles became Jews as a result of this event, out of fear for the Jews. When the day came, the Jews in Persia defended themselves, killing 500 in Susa alone. Esther asked for another day, the following day, for the Jews to again attack those who had sought to kill them, and the king agreed. In the 2 days, the Jews in Persia killed over 75,000 people, but did not take any of their plunder. Jews for 2,500 years have celebrated the feast of Purim to commemorate the deliverance of the Jews from the destruction Haman had planned. Purim is usually in March, and the next year it will be on March 6th and 7th. So the lessons we can take from are essentially the first edition of The Bachelor that ever existed. There's the king who wants a new queen, gets all the women in the town to come to him. They take a year of beauty treatments, and then he decides on who the queen is. There are several lessons we can take from all this. We can learn the importance of godly counsel, such as Mordecai's counsel to Esther. That's something for me that has been huge in my life. I have several people that I have relied on throughout the years for godly counsel, and it's not always counsel you want to hear, but it is counsel that you need. Rob has given me advice on several occasions, so has David and Dean and pretty much every other member of the family that lives up here. I've relied on godly counsel from them, especially when it comes to dealing with things that I had a reputation of being a hothead about before I got up here. And I think it's been pretty under control since I've been here. And that's because I have the people around me. And you don't tell Hannah, a lot of it has to do with her. She keeps me calm. Just don't tell her I said that. I can't have said anything nice. But that counsel is important. Nick provides counsel to me too, especially when I was put in charge of being the youth person for several, Matthew, how many times was that the case? A lot, up until we got the lovely blessing of Jake, which now that's all him. He can have it because he's great at it. I'm mediocre at it at best. I'll keep that one. Yep, that's the story. I'll keep that. But Nick provided a lot of counsel and things because that I wasn't prepared to do, especially in that position. And even, let me see, I don't want to call Nick old because that's what gets Jake in trouble. Jake provides wisdom that I don't have as a married man that's been there a lot longer than I have. And so he has helped me in other things, and it's counsel from people, especially if they're older than you, is something that is valuable, especially if it's godly counsel. We can learn how the providence of God is used by him to put us exactly where we need to be, exactly when we need to be there. Just like Esther ascending to be queen at such a crucial time in her people's history. That counsel you receive from everybody else shows you something you may not be able to see. Esther at the time didn't see why she was put there. She was put there to save her people. She just didn't know it yet. Mordecai happens to be the one that points that out to her. The primary lesson, though, we should learn is in Esther's life is the value of spending time in prayer and fasting before we act on an important matter. An interesting fact about the book of Esther is that God is not mentioned in the entire book. Not once is God's names mentioned, or even the word prayer used in the 10 chapters of the book. Bible scholars believe that this was done so the story of Esther could be copied and shared in areas where people were hostile towards the Jews and their faith. But even though his name's not mentioned and prayer is not mentioned, it is something that is present throughout the entirety of the story. All of these things happen because of God's providence to put those things into place. Esther becoming queen. Mordecai rising to the position he's in and being able to tell the king about an assassination attempt. Even Haman, his part was providenced by God to be in there. So regardless if the word prayer is used or God is not mentioned, it is understood that God was providentially orchestrating the events of Esther's life. We also know that a natural part of fasting is prayer, and Esther would have surely spent much time in prayer before entering King Xerxes' court. And again, if the rule of law is if you enter the court without his permission and he doesn't extend the scepter to you, your life's done. That could have been the end of her, and that could have been the end of her people. And so the providence of God is there. Fasting is a practice of going without food or something else for a set period of time so the individual can focus more intently on God and how he is working through a situation. Part of fasting is praying during the time of fasting and asking God to work through the situation as his will dictates. Although the deliverance of the Jews from Haman's plan was a matter of great urgency, it was still something that Esther needed to prayerfully consider before jumping into action. Esther shows us the importance of a measured, methodical approach to issues and the importance of praying and fasting before dealing with those situations. We all need to take the same measured and methodical approach to issues we deal with in life. We need to take our time, evaluate the situation, and then spend time in prayer and fasting. When we do, we make ourselves more sensitive to the Lord's leadership and guidance. We'll also find ourselves to be like Esther, widely approaching situations that could be difficult and dangerous with the help of an almighty God. So we've all made decisions at some point in our life that were very large decisions that were going to make you pay a price. Whether it was moving from one place to another, looking at a different job, looking at who you're going to marry, looking at what you're going to do in your children's lives. All of those are things that we can pray about and use that providence that God is putting in our life to do what he wants to be done. It's not our will, but his will. So it's the importance of prayer and the importance of fasting is the hard one for me. I really like to eat, but fasting has had its benefits when it comes to prayer for me. But I know that in the end, there's a lot of places I would be in my life without prayer at this point, and probably one of them is not up here. So that was a decision that I used, that I prayed about a lot before we moved up here. Was I making the right move? Did I need to stay where I was? Was it, because if those of you that don't know me as well, I had a 92-year-old grandfather that I was living with and taking care of when I left Clover. And so my biggest concern was what happens to him if I leave. And so had I not been in prayer and had I not talked to people that were giving me counsel at that time, I'm probably not up here. We're probably living in Clover. And so that was one of those decisions that I went to, and I spent probably the last 6 months of that school year that I was still in South Carolina deciding what I was going to do next. And I wouldn't change anything since I've moved up here, but that was a very prayer-guided decision for both me and Hannah, because that was hard for me to leave Clover, especially when Pavel was still there. So that's all I have for tonight. That was quick and easy and to the point. It's kind of like how I do normally. So let's see, who's Deacon of the Week this week? That's Dennis, but he's not here. Would you close us in prayer tonight?